Sitting in the lively yet artificial atmosphere of my family gathering, I could feel my heart racing as my father's voice pierced the din. "Sophia, stand up," he commanded sharply, drawing everyone's attention to me. I stood awkwardly, my face flushed with embarrassment, fearing my latest misstep. My lighthearted trick about a fictitious inheritance check had ignited their wrath. "Did you think that was funny?" my father scolded, his face flushed with ire. "Embarrassing us before everyone," he continued harshly. I barely stammered a reply. It was just a joke, my voice barely audible amid my trembling. My mother's words were cutting. "Do you think our family is a joke, Sophia?" Before I could articulate a defense, my father seized a cord from a corner and stormed towards me, commanding, "Sit down," as he pointed to a chair at the room's center. Humiliated, I sank into the seat as he bound my wrists, the ropes cutting into my skin. I fought back tears as laughter and low whispers churned in the room. My brother Liam leaned against the wall observing with a smirk. My father declared, "This is what happens when you disrespect us," as humiliation engulfed me. I bit my lip, refusing to break down. Their voices faded into the background noise as my parents continued their tirade. Suddenly, the front door crashed open, silencing the room, and there stood Uncle Richard, his presence commanding in his tailored suit. His eyes scanned the scene before settling on the ropes binding me. His voice thundered, "What the hell is happening here?" My father, caught off guard, tried to dismiss him. "Richard, this isn't of your concern." But Richard asserted, "It is now," and crossing the room, he knelt before me, a softness in his voice. "Are you all right, Sophie?" Unable to trust my voice, I nodded, even as tears threatened. Standing, Richard faced my parents, his voice an icy command, "Untie her." My mother protested weakly, "It's discipline she needs," to which Richard retorted, his anger now closer to the surface, "This is cruelty, not discipline." My father hesitated, but Richard's unwavering glare forced him to comply, and he released the ropes. My hands free, I tenderly rubbed at the raw marks on my wrists. Richard then turned to me with a softened expression. "Pack your things," he instructed. My mother's voice was a desperate wail. "You can't just take her." Richard, however, was resolute. "I can, and I will. You've shown you don't deserve her." My father attempted protest. "You don't understand." But Richard cut him off decisively. "Oh, Peter, I understand perfectly. I've watched you and Amanda erode her spirit for years, and it stops now." My parents exchanged alarmed glances, aware that Richard's wealth and influence put them at a disadvantage. His presence was something they couldn't challenge, without risk. "This is a mistake," my mother hissed, her anger barely contained. Richard's reply was calm yet final. "The only mistake is how you've treated your daughter." He turned to me once more. "You're coming with me. You don't belong here." Trailing behind Richard, I exited the house, my pace unsure initially, but quickening as freedom beckoned. The cool night air was a balm, whispering liberation as Richard's black car idled, headlights beaming reassurance. Opening the door for me, he instructed, "Get in," his tone gentle yet firm. I slipped into the passenger seat as my heart thudded. Behind us, my parents stood on the porch, my mother's features twisted in anger and my father's typical bombast deflated. Liam peered out, his smirk replaced by a hint of regret. As Richard settled in and started the engine, the powerful roar obscured the voices from the porch. A final glance back, as we departed, revealed my mother's silhouette fading into the night. Richard's voice cut through my thoughts, steady and soothing. "You don't need to look back anymore. You're free now." Arriving at Richard's estate was like stepping into a new realm. The grand house rose magnificently, surrounded by gardens that stretched beyond view. Under the moonlit sky, the sleekly modern architecture gleamed, while the soft glow from within rendered the mansion inviting. Richard unlocked the front door and declared, "This is your home now," with unspoken promises of safety and belonging tracing the threshold. As Richard led me inside, I was taken aback by the interior, soaring ceilings, sleek floors, and walls adorned with bookshelves and art. Despite its splendor, the The house felt warm and welcoming, not at all intimidating. Richard gestured for me to follow him up the staircase, leading me to a spacious guest room with a comfortable bed, a desk by the window, and views of the expansive gardens below. "Take your time settling in," he said before leaving. As I sat on the bed's edge, the night's events replayed in my mind, the embarrassment, the anger, and Richard stepping in like a shield I never knew I had. For the first time in years, a flicker of hope sparked within me. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the windows, drenching the room in golden light. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was until memories of the previous night came flooding back. I found Richard in the dining room, sitting at a long table set with breakfast. He looked up with a warm smile. "Good morning," he said. "Did you sleep well?" I nodded, though my sleep had been restless. "Thank you for everything," I expressed sincerely. Richard shrugged off my gratitude. "You don't have to thank me, Sophia. What they did to you was wrong," he said with conviction. "It's my responsibility to ensure your safety now." As we ate, he gently asked me about my interests and dreams, topics I'd never had the opportunity to explore. "What do you love?" he asked curiously. The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated. "I used to love writing," I confessed. "When I was younger, I would write stories all the time, but my parents said it was frivolous." Richard's eyes darkened, though his voice remained composed. "They were mistaken. If writing brings you joy, you should pursue it." A few days later, Richard invited me to his study. "I've been contemplating," he began. "You've endured so much, Sophia, more than anyone should bear. Consider therapy." The suggestion felt daunting. Therapy was alien and almost taboo, dismissed by my parents as an indulgence for the weak. But Richard spoke with care and encouragement. "I understand it's a lot to consider," he reassured. "It might help, and you don't have to face this alone." I hesitated but found solace in his tone. "Okay," I agreed finally. "I'll try." Richard arranged for me to see Dr. Elena Carter, a therapist he held in high regard. Her office was inviting and cozy, a breath of fresh air compared to the sterile spaces I'd imagined therapy to be. During our first session, I spoke at my own pace, finding comfort in her gentle presence. "I've always felt inadequate," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "No matter what I did, it was never enough for them." Dr. Carter nodded, a serious kindness in her expression. "That's a heavy burden to bear, but it's not yours to carry. Their actions reflect more on them than on you." Her words lingered long after the session ended, sowing the seeds of healing. With therapy arming me with tools to cope, Richard supported me in rediscovering my passion for writing. He transformed a corner of my room into a writing nook, complete with a new laptop and shelves brimming with books on creativity and storytelling. "This is your space," he declared. "No pressure, just write what feels right." Initially, the words came slowly. I hadn't written in years, and the blank page was daunting. But as I let myself dive into the process, something shifted. Writing became a sanctuary, a means to process my emotions and reclaim my voice. One evening, I shared a short story with Richard, a tale of a girl who escaped a tower and found freedom in the wilderness. He read attentively and looked up with eyes brimming with pride. "This is extraordinary, Sophia," he acknowledged. "You have a talent." For the first time, I felt more than the girl my parents had tried to suppress. I was someone with dreams, talent, and a future. Weeks turned to months, and I settled into a new life. Therapy sessions with Dr. Carter continued to dismantle the walls I had built around myself, while my writing thrived under Richard's encouragement. It felt like breathing fresh air for the first time in years. One afternoon, Richard found me in the garden with a notebook resting on my knees as I sketched a new story outline. He sat beside me, offering a cup of tea. "How's it coming along?" he asked, nodding towards the notebook. "Better than I expected," I admitted. "It feels freeing, like I'm finally voicing long-held thoughts." He nodded, acknowledging my newfound liberation. I gazed thoughtfully at him. His words resonated with me. Writing allows you to have a voice, even when it feels like no one hears you. For such a long time, I had felt invisible and voiceless, but with each word I put down, I started to feel a bit stronger, a little more complete. One morning, while sitting at the dining room table revising my latest story draft, Richard approached me with an envelope. My name was scrawled on the front in familiar handwriting, my mother's. "I found this in the mailbox today," he said with a neutral tone. "You don't need to open it if you don't want to." My hands trembled as I held the envelope. Part of me wanted to rip it apart, to reject any attempt they made to reconnect, yet curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I opened it and unfolded the letter. The words were clipped, formal, and void of warmth. My mother wrote how the family was concerned about my decision to leave and hoped I would reconsider. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the pain they'd caused, just veiled criticism and attempts to guilt me into coming back. I handed the letter to Richard, my throat tightening. He read it silently, his expression unreadable. "You owe them nothing," he finally said, his voice firm. "Remember that." I nodded, but the letter lingered in my mind for days. It wasn't just their words. It was the realization that they still held sway over me, even from afar. During my subsequent therapy session, I brought up the letter. Dr. Carter listened closely as I expressed my feelings of guilt and anger, the conflicting emotions that offered no peace.
"It's normal to feel that way," she said.
"They were your parents. You desired their love and approval. That longing doesn't vanish, even when you've been hurt by them." Her words resonated deeply. I realized part of me still craved their validation, even if it would never materialize. Letting go of that hope was one of the hardest things, yet it was liberating. By session's end, I felt lighter. I didn't require their approval or anything from them. What truly mattered was the life I was building for myself. As weeks went by, I poured my emotions into writing. Richard, ever the supportive mentor, encouraged me to submit one of my stories to a local writing contest. The thought terrified me, but his unwavering confidence gave me the push I needed. To my surprise, my story won first place. The prize wasn't just a cash award, it was the validation my parents had never given. My work was good, I was good. At the award ceremony, Richard beamed with pride as I accepted the trophy. "This is just the beginning," he said with conviction.
"You have so much more to give."
The high from winning was tempered by an invitation that arrived soon after, a request to attend a family gathering at my parents' house. Initially, I wanted to ignore it, but Richard convinced me otherwise.
"You don't have to go for them," he said.
"Go for yourself, to show them who you've become." The thought of returning to that house filled me with dread, but he was right. I wasn't the same person they had once humiliated. I was stronger. Upon my arrival, the atmosphere was tense. My mother greeted me with a tight smile, while my father barely acknowledged me. Liam, as usual, wore his signature smirk. Dinner was a quiet affair, the conversation stilted and awkward, but as the plates were cleared, my father finally spoke up. "So," he said with sarcasm, "I hear you're having a good time with Richard. Must be nice having someone else pay your way." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Actually, I've been supporting myself. I'm in a writing program and just won a competition for one of my stories." My mother's fork clattered against her plate as she shot me a sharp look. "Writing isn't a real career." "It is for me," I replied firmly, "and I'm good at it." Richard, who had been silent, leaned forward. "She's better than good. She's exceptional. You should be proud of her." The room fell silent, the power dynamics shifting instantly. My parents, despite their bluster, had nothing to say. For the first time, I felt in control. Walking out of my parents' house that evening felt like shedding a heavy burden. The air outside was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension inside. Richard walked beside me, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder, reminding me I wasn't alone. "You handled that well," he said as we got in the car. "Thanks," I replied, quieter than expected. The truth was, I wasn't sure how I felt, empowering as it was. The confrontation left an emptiness within me, a hollow ache, reminding me of what could never be. "They didn't win," Richard said as he revved the engine. I nodded, watching the house shrink in the rearview mirror. For the first time, I felt capable of leaving them all behind. The fiery confrontation with my parents sparked a determination in me. Their voices had overshadowed mine for years, but now I was resolute to speak louder than ever before. I immersed myself in my writing, channeling the pain and triumph of my journey into inspiration. Noticing my newfound focus, Richard suggested a bold step, a novel. "It's time, Sophia," he said one evening in his library. "You've shown you can tell a story. Now it's time to tell your story." The thought of writing a novel intimidated me. It seemed monumental, nearly impossible. However, Richard's confidence was contagious, prompting me to start sketching some ideas. The story would be deeply personal, a fictionalized recount of my escape from my family's chains and the journey to discover my identity. Writing the novel was both draining and exhilarating. Countless hours were spent at my desk, piecing together fragments of memories and emotions into a coherent narrative. Some days, words flowed freely. Other days, I was paralyzed by self-doubt, staring at a blank screen. Richard became my biggest supporter, checking in frequently and offering encouragement and feedback whenever I was stuck. "Remember why you're doing this," he reminded me one evening. "This is your story. No one else can tell it." His words saw me through the toughest moments, and after dedicated months of effort, I finally completed the first draft. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Beyond emotional support, Richard's influence extended into professional realms. Utilizing his connections, he introduced me to a literary agent willing to critique my manuscript. The agent's feedback, though firm, was constructive. The story was powerful but needed refining. With a renewed sense of purpose, I dived into revisions, determined to strengthen the narrative. Each change was like chiseling away at a rough stone, revealing the beauty that lay underneath. Working on the novel also meant processing more of my past. In therapy one afternoon, I shared a pivotal childhood moment when I tried to assert myself but was sharply dismissed by my parents. They made me feel wrong for even trying, I confessed, voice cracking. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. "Yet you're here now. You tried then, and you're trying now. That resilience has brought you to this point." Her words resonated profoundly. I wasn't just writing a story. I was reclaiming my voice, my agency, my life. After exhaustive months of revisions, I submitted the final manuscript to my agent. The waiting period was grueling, but Richard reminded me to have faith in the process. "You've already done the hardest part," he said. "Now let it find its place." When the call finally came, I could hardly grasp it. A major publisher expressed interest in my novel. A rush of emotions, joy, disbelief, a quiet triumph, overcame me. My story was going to be released into the world, potentially inspiring others who felt silenced. The day of the contract signing was surreal, with Richard present beside me, pride visible in his approving smile and reassuring clap on my back. "This is just the beginning," he declared. The publisher set a release date, and promotional activities began. Interviews, photo shoots, marketing meetings filled my days, yet none of it felt burdensome. I was sharing my story, and that made it all worthwhile. News of my book's release reached my parents quickly. One evening, Richard handed me another letter, this time from my father. Surprisingly brief, it congratulated me on my success, but was laced with backhanded compliments, labeling my achievement as unexpected and lucky. It was precisely the dismissive, condescending response I anticipated. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Their opinions no longer held power over me. The night of the book launch was a whirlwind. Friends, industry professionals, and even fans crowded the venue. Richard remained by my side, support unwavering. During my speech, a surge of emotion swept over me as I addressed the audience. "This book is a testament to the power of resilience," I announced, "to finding your voice when others attempt to silence you, and to those who believe in you even when self-belief falters." As the book hit the shelves, the overwhelming response amazed me. Readers reached out, sharing how the narrative captured their hearts and mirrored their own journeys, each message serving as a personal victory, not just for me but for all who ever felt unseen. As my book climbed the bestseller lists, new opportunities emerged, media interviews, invitations to speak at events poured in. At first, the attention was overpowering, yet Richard's characteristic calmness helped me to navigate it. "You're here because you've earned it," he reminded me one evening prior to a live interview. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Those words became my anchor as I confronted questions about my background, my journey, and the message behind my book. I spoke truthfully, though I carefully chose my words, avoiding naming my parents directly. It wasn't about exposing them, but about narrating my story. The more I articulated, the more my confidence grew. I wasn't merely sharing my experiences, I was reclaiming them and shaping them into something meaningful. As I was getting ready for a book signing event one evening, my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Hesitantly, I picked up. "Sophia." The voice on the other line sounded hesitant and unsure. It was Liam. "What do you want?" I asked more sharply than intended. "I've been reading your book," he said. I didn't see things the way you did." His words surprised me. For years, Liam had been our parents' golden child, implicit in their favoritism. Hearing him acknowledge my pain felt surreal. "I'm not looking for an apology," I said, "if that's what this is about." "It's not," he quickly replied. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how I treated you, for not standing up for you when I should have." The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, and for the first time, I felt a thread of understanding between us. "Thank you," I said softly. "That means more than you know." Liam's apology signaled the beginning of a tentative relationship. He admitted that living up to our parents' expectations had been suffocating for him in its own way. "I didn't realize how much of myself I was losing," he confessed during one of our conversations. His words resonated with me, and I found myself forgiving him, not just for his complicity, but for his struggles as well. We were not the same people who had lived under our parents' roof, and that realization gave us an opportunity to forge a new bond. Later, another letter arrived from my parents, different from before. It wasn't filled with backhanded compliments or veiled criticisms. It was a rare acknowledgement of their actions, written in shaky, uncertain handwriting. "We didn't realize how much we hurt you," my mother wrote. "We thought we were doing what was best, but now we see how wrong we were." The letter stirred a complex mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a faint glimmer of hope. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was something. When I showed the letter to Richard, he studied it for a long moment before speaking. "It's up to you whether you respond," he said, "but remember, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing yourself from their power." I chose not to respond, not out of hatred, but because I didn't need anything more from them. Their acknowledgement, however imperfect, was enough. I had moved on, and I wasn't looking back. During therapy, Dr. Carter helped me unpack the letter and the emotions it stirred. "Closure isn't something they can give you," she said. "It's something you give yourself." Her words stayed with me, and over time, the weight of my past began to lift. I wasn't defined by my parents' treatment of me. I was defined by the life I had built in spite of it. The day my second book, a follow-up to my memoir focusing on healing and growth, was released, I found myself reflecting on how far I had come. Richard stood beside me at the launch event, his pride evident. "This is your legacy," he said, "not the pain they gave you. This." His words brought tears to my eyes. He had been my rock, my guide, and my biggest supporter. Without him, I wouldn't have found the strength to rebuild myself. That night, as I signed books and greeted readers, I felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for Richard, but for myself, for the courage it took to keep going. Years later, I found myself back at Richard's estate, the place that had become my sanctuary. The gardens were as beautiful as ever, the house still filled with warmth and love. Richard and I sat on the terrace, sipping tea as the sun dipped below the horizon. "You've built something incredible," he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You've turned your pain into something that helps others." I smiled, my heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you." Richard shook his head. "You did this, Sophia. I just gave you the space to find yourself." As the stars began to appear in the sky, I felt a deep sense of peace. My journey had been long and painful, but it had brought me to this moment. A moment of freedom, love, and self-acceptance. Richard had become more than just an uncle. He was the father I had always wished for, and together we had built a new kind of family, one based on love, respect, and mutual support.